Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happen to be listening to this. Welcome to the Film Realist Podcast, the film and TV podcast from a complete nobody that is hopefully for somebody. I am your host, Kyle Naranya, for a Marvel-packed episode where I will be reviewing and giving my general opinion on Loki Season 2, as well as the latest cinematic installment in the Marvel Cinematic Universe with The Marvels. Now, typically I would like to do a non-spoiler section of a television review. However, I'm not going to do that with this episode just because there are so many elements, particularly when you are discussing something that involves time travel, that I think I'm going to have a hard time discussing. So for Loki, there will be only a non-spoiler review. There will only be a spoiler review where the Marvels will have a non-spoiler review and a spoiler review. But for Loki, you've been warned, I will be talking about the show with full spoilers, plot details, potential implications on the future of the Marvel Universe with this show. So if you haven't watched Loki and you don't want it spoiled, you can skip that section until you have had a chance to finish season 2 and jump right into the Marvels. But I'm going to start the first review of this episode with a full spoiler review of Loki Season 2. Now, I've given my general thoughts on Twitter, which was I thought that Loki had a great finale, but ultimately the season was a mess that reminded me of series 6 and 7 of Doctor Who. Now, if you're not a Doctor Who fan, you may not know what I'm talking about, so I'm just going to focus on Loki. I believe that they had a phenomenal idea for how they were going to conclude this season, even if there was some mandates into how they were going to connect to Kang and the potential Kang dynasty, which we may or may not be getting anymore. I don't think that negatively affected the show whatsoever. I think that what didn't work in the first season, in my opinion, was the fact that this Loki was pulled out of 2012 Avengers and essentially got to watch all of his character arc on a TV screen while in the TVA. So he emotionally is not in the same place where we had Loki, who ultimately sacrificed himself for Thor in Infinity War, which was a phenomenal end to that character's arc. We had a much different one to some degree, yet at the same time similar with this version of Loki TVA version, I guess. That's a terrible sentence. I apologize. And so my hopes weren't high for season 2. I've talked about generally how I didn't really love the first season, but my biggest criticism of this second season is somehow, and I find this really interesting, that the show is too long and too short, where there are so many different threads, pun intended, that they are trying to weave together with maybe a potential time loom into all of these different ideas. And there does not seem to be a focus as to what the purpose of this season is until the back half, where we really do get a focus on Loki in the second half, particularly with what he's experiencing. But let's start off at the beginning, where Loki now has his time loop powers. A lot of people had speculated that that was going to have to do with similar elements like the glitching in the Spider-Verse films. And ultimately, while it does look physically similar, they don't tie together particularly the same, as he has more of time slipping as opposed to dimensional slipping, which is also one of the frustrations that I have with this show, which is we are building to this multiverse war with Kang Dynasty and Secret Wars, which we already know have been announced. And the MCU's consistent inconsistency when explaining what the multiverse is in particular, I still find to be quite muddled. You have time variants, which are things happen that alter the timeline, and you get these branched timelines. Loki being an example of that. He was once again given the Tesseract in the time travel element of Endgame, resulting in him being a time variant. And them using the word variance, I find, as somebody who's paying attention, and again, if I've gotten this wrong, let me know, but my impression has been that anytime anyone's been anything remotely different from the sacred timeline we've experienced is a variant. Now, Again, given the significance of what was supposed to have happened in the first season with Sophie killing He Who Remains, a variant of Kang, and that resulting in potentially multiversal travel and branches of the timeline spreading from the quote-unquote sacred one, none of those seem to have any implications in any of the multiverse films we've had so far, particularly with Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, as well as Spider-Man No Way Home. In my opinion, Peter Parker, played by Andrew Garfield, and Tobey Maguire, those aren't variants. They are different versions in the multiverse, at least the way in which I've understand how multiversal travel and different versions of the character has worked when done in the comic book form. An example being like Ben Affleck and Christian Bale are not variants of each other. They're different versions throughout the multiverse. Christian Bale, Ben Affleck, and now Robert Pattinson all live in a different universe, their own specific Earth. And the implications of that Kang, He Who Remains, and then the one we had in Quantumania, those, I'm going to say it again, threads don't seem to tie together whatsoever. Now, Loki works significantly well when dealing with its own time manipulation, and I did really enjoy that, particularly with having back and forths in the element of time travel that I do like with cause and effect. It's something I did talk about with Rob on my episode where we evaluated my favorite science fiction films of the 21st century, and Looper being one of those with specific cause and effect. And the chicken or the egg element that this does address is the antithesis of how time travel worked in Endgame. So again, one of those frustrations is that with this lack of continuity within their continuity of how time travel works, even though I know it's established that time works differently in the TVA, cause and effect working the way that most people understood it in other time travel properties is significantly confusing. We still don't know if Captain America traveled on the sacred timeline or created his own branch timelines. If so, wouldn't the TVA have arrested him? But that's neither here nor there. Here, not. Wow. I'm just going to leave this in. This is a one-take podcast. It usually is, so let's just keep it that way. And so I really liked how we had less characters to focus on, and with this, we had the same cast of characters from the TVA, but we also had the introduction of OB, or Ouroboros, with Ke Huy Quan, and I loved that portrayal of that character, somebody who's so knee-deep in everything that's happening in the TVA, and somebody who is essentially responsible for a version of Kang with Victor Timely, and him being a focus of the first half of the episodes, I think really does add for shock factor. Again, we're in full spoilers, but resulting in the death of this version of Kang, and the consequences of what's happening seems to be on such a significant scale, but ultimately, because of the flux that the MCU is in because of real world events, I'm very curious to see how all these sewing puns are just naturally coming, and I apologize, but weave that into the future moving forward with something happening with obviously Jonathan Majors and what potentially they could do. Now, as somebody who really enjoyed the original versions of Secret Wars, I would just absolutely love if they did the Beyonder. If you were a child of the 90s, you know the Beyonder from the Spider-Man Secret Wars that was done, which was quite fun, and it was cool to have a more Spider-Man focused Spider-Verse or multiverse. It's funny how the Spider-Man multiverse things always tend up being better. And so I really do like that focus being at what's stake for this. But again, with this being a pocket of the universe that hasn't seemed to actually had effect on the whole universe, the stakes are large, but they don't seem to be taking hold with the other properties, which I found particularly confusing when I get to the feature film review of this episode. The elements that I absolutely adored, and this is not something that is surprising, Tom Hiddleston has continued to develop this character and show depth to somebody who so easily could have been a one-note villain. And what I give a lot of praise to for him particularly is, as somebody who was emotionally done with the character by his passing in Infinity War, finding a new dimension to this character and truly finding a purpose for him outside of the main storyline was something that I didn't necessarily want to see, but ultimately I think they delivered a very successful potential conclusion to this character. Again, we're in full spoilers. And having Loki experience essentially a Groundhog Day with them trying to save the time loom because of all these expanding branched threads and the loom not being able to consistently absorb all this energy and it resulting in a cataclysmic explosion and that destroying the TVA, and him using time slipping to try to figure out how to solve that and learning things such as physics from OB over and over and consistently trying to change events from happening, and this resulting in the same conclusion, and this ultimately leading him to go back into season 1. This is the element of time travel I found really compelling, where we get to see a completely new point of view on the story he's experienced before. And his own point of view dramatically changes when you get to see the conversations and perspective from He Who Remains, and knowing that the resulting death he is going to experience and what kind of cataclysm that's going to result in the universe as a whole, particularly with preventing. And again, they use variants, but personally, I don't think they're using that term correctly, but regardless, other versions of Kang, and I believe they even reference Kang the Conqueror, who was in Ant-Man Quantumania, and Loki developing these time slipping, learning what his purpose is, and that ultimately he does not want to be alone. One of the elements that I was a little disappointed that it isn't addressed is that he still does have his brother somewhere out there in the universe, but that he has made this new family, quite similarly to something like Black Widow had made until you watch Black Widow, the film, but that's besides the point, with the Avengers, and that he has made this family in the TVA, and that he does not want to be alone. And ultimately realizing that he cannot stop Sophie from killing Kang, and he can't kill her, and he ultimately does find a way out of that in becoming the new He Who Remains, threading the universe's timelines together, at least this version's timelines, into not sensual, it's not that kind of show, into a sacred time tree that looks shockingly like Yggdrasil, which I believe is what it's called. It seems to be something similar to that. But regardless, he is able to become the center of time, out of time, keeping everything together and allowing the variants who were living on branched timelines to continue to live out their life. And there's been a lot of TikToks about this, and I don't think I've actually publicly said this, but I always make sure that I avoid even reviews for the content that I'm reviewing, but getting little Easter eggs and whatnot that I may not have noticed, I think those do add to a review, but I don't listen to anybody else's before I record my own, even though I know this comes out typically on Monday nights. I'll listen to that stuff after, and then it's fun to see if we had thoughts on similar wavelengths, but all of the different Easter eggs that people have noticed, just Easter eggs, not opinions, in connecting to Loki's history leading up to Avengers, particularly with the very first Thor film, and that he is doing this for other people and doing something completely selfless, when his intentions to obviously what he was doing in Thor being the complete opposite, where he was doing horrible things thinking they would be required for seeing in favor by his father that potentially may have resulted in him being king. And this ultimate sacrifice that he is no longer going to be with the people that he wants to be, that he is going to be outside of it, that he is burdened with glorious purpose, the name of the final episode, I thought was a phenomenal ending to a character who I'm quite shocked that they gave another one to. Now, obviously you can speculate that because he is now outside of time and significantly interconnected to the universe and time itself and potentially the multiverse, all of it, I don't know another way of putting that it wouldn't be surprising if Loki comes back in whatever version of Kang Dynasty we do get or Secret Wars. But given the fact that he has played this character for 12 years now, I think it would be a phenomenal place to leave Loki. I'm somebody who, as I said earlier, thought that they gave him a phenomenal conclusion in Infinity War, and the fact that they managed to do that again, I think it is time to let this character go, unless, similar to what Chris Evans has said, you can continue the character storyline or have the character return, and it is near perfect. If he is ultimately going to become a hero that helps save the universe again, I don't know if that adds as opposed to just showing more of it. I guess we will see. Thankfully, the strikes are over, so whatever's going to move into production is going to do so. And I'm hoping, given the extra time that these films now do have, that ultimately we get to see a more fine-tuned multiverse saga with Phase 5 continuing. But I guess we will wait and see. There hasn't been any confirmation on a season 3. I kind of hope that there isn't one, and that we can leave one of these characters who we have seen consistently throughout all 5 phases now, that we let this character at least rest in his new place as God Loki, I believe, as the Funko Pop has listed it. But that's my general thoughts on Loki, with some obviously spoiler details. You can tweet at me or the podcast, or send an email what you thought about Loki. I don't want to talk about that anymore. What I do want to do is jump into general opinions on the Marvels, which I'm going to do right now. All right, so the Marvels is a culmination of Captain Marvel, WandaVision, and Miss Marvel. So let's say there's a lot to cover in this, so the general opinion of this is probably not going to be very long, so apologies if that is the case. Written and directed by Nia DaCosta, who I believe co-wrote, I should look this up, co-wrote and directed, yep, she was involved in that, the more recent Candyman film, which was absolutely phenomenal. I did have to see it during the daytime, because if you are a fan of this podcast, you know that horror movies keep me up late at night, and I typically have nightmares, so I have to watch them during the day. The Marvels is a film that I had a wildly entertaining time with. The 3 leads, with Brie Larson, Tiona Paris, and Iman Vellani. Shout out to Iman Vellani, one of the Canadians who is maintaining the quality of the MCU, the other 2 being Tatiana Maslany and Simu Liu. And I was super excited to see the 3 of them together, particularly with Captain Marvel. Brie Larson is somebody who hasn't really had the opportunity to actually portray Captain Marvel yet, where we had Captain Marvel and Carol not having her memories, so she's not really playing the character she is, because she's learning about who she is in that film, and then in Endgame not being in it long enough. So ironically, we've spent more time with Monica Rambeau and oh my goodness, my brain just turned to mush, and Kamala Khan than we have with Captain Marvel. And I like the fact that this is titled The Marvels, as it is covering a substantial amount of Captain Marvel content as well as Miss Marvel, but also addressing other elements, and also not addressing other elements that you would think would be involved in something that kind of has all these different elements to it. And this is really the first time one of these films has done it to this degree. Of course, we had WandaVision, which did lead into Doctor Strange, but Doctor Strange only really had I wouldn't even say it even addressed Doctor Strange 1, but it was just bouncing off of Endgame and WandaVision, where this is 2 separate TV shows as well as 2 films continuation. Actually, 3 if you want to talk about Secret Wars. Not Secret Wars, Secret Invasion. So there's a certain amount of plot elements that this does require you to have seen. This is probably the first film with the launch of Disney Plus that I think you would be absolutely lost in if you have not been watching the television shows, which, as somebody who has watched them, I really did appreciate. I think you need to make these films watchable for people who haven't watched the shows, but I think you are missing out on a substantial amount if you have not watched them yet. There has been a significant sorry, it's been a very long day. There has been significant criticism towards the film in terms of its plot, its villains, its effects as a whole. It's overall, not that I like using this, but I'm going to pull it up anyways for the sake of the episode, which is, it is currently rated fresh on Rotten Tomatoes with 62 and an audience score, critic score, and an audience score of 84. And it's been something I've discussed on the podcast probably since the beginning of She-Hulk, which is that there seems to be, obviously superhero fatigue is something people are talking about, but the way that I think I would phrase it is that television shows and movies that would typically be regarded as average were received more positively than they would have beforehand. And I don't know if that had something to do with the Marvel Studios banner being covered in that, or the film being the film being a part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe prevented it from getting criticism that films outside of the Marvel Cinematic Universe would typically get. Great example is Thor: The Dark World. I don't think that's a very good movie, and it was ultimately reviewed quite positively by audiences and critics, which I found quite interesting at the time. That film coming out 10 years ago now, which is mind-blowing. But the film does so. I should start off with a positive, so that's what I'm going to do. I found this movie to be wildly entertaining. The chemistry between Brie Larson, Tiana Paris, and Iman Vellani was absolutely captivating. Particularly Iman Vellani's portrayal of Kamala Khan is so pitch perfect, and getting to see this character in the larger Marvel Cinematic Universe is so... Oh, it's amazing. I almost cursed, and I don't want to, because then I'd have to edit it out on my own. But getting to see somebody who was in such a microcosm with Jersey City and getting to be part of this grand space adventure really shows the differences in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Getting small city level characters and putting them in this cosmic adventures is so fun. Particularly the scale of which these events are occurring is so substantially larger than, even though there was some time travel elements in Miss Marvel, but ultimately, the scope of this is so much larger. It's shocking how short this movie is. With an hour and 45 minutes, it is moving along at quite a pace, and I think that there are elements missing. It does feel rushed at times. Unfortunately, I think it probably has one of the worst villains we've experienced in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and I think ultimately that comes down to a lack of time. Even though Ronan the Accuser was a character who wasn't super loved in Guardians of the Galaxy and was explored to some degree again in Captain Marvel, we don't get a ton of time with Dar-Ben, and the character just seems evil for evil's sake. They do give her some motivation, but ultimately because we are given so little time with her, I just don't think it's enough, and she just seems very one note in that character's motivation. I think the relationship is explored in the movie, particularly between Carol and Monica, is something I was really looking forward to, and I liked a lot of what they had to do with this. We do know that this ultimately, and so I don't want to get into non-spoilers. So I think the overall scope of the movie is quite large, but from a script level, I don't think it is as tight as other films in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I do not think it is by far, it is certainly not the worst. I know a lot of people are talking about box office fatigue with these franchises and mixed critical reception, and I do feel it's becoming, I would say, a more objective reviewing of these films in general. Now, is this my favorite Marvel Cinematic Universe movie? No, but with the humor being so well executed in this film, I found myself to be the most entertained I had been post-Endgame. Now, is that going to affect its rewatchability? It might, because typically, in my opinion, films that lean heavier into humor don't offer rewatchability, because the story in itself is quite simple with what's going on, and with there being less time to be invested in the overall story, it probably is easier to rewatch, but you're getting less and less with each rewatch. There are less levels to explore with this film overall. I think it's quite predictable, which is good and bad. I don't think it's going to be shocking a lot of people with what they do, but ultimately this offers, I think, what the Marvel Cinematic Universe can do at its best, which is an entertaining popcorn flick with characters that you do know, and getting to see more time with them is something that I'm always looking forward to. So, without getting into any further spoilers, that's probably going to wrap up my general opinions. I think it's fun. I don't think you have to see this in the theater, but I did quite enjoy seeing this with a crowd, so I would recommend seeing it. If you enjoyed all the different stories that these characters were in previously with Captain Marvel, Miss Marvel, and WandaVision, I would say that you would enjoy this as well. This is not on the same level as something like The Winter Soldier, but where this film clearly aims for entertainment and just having you enjoy the overall watching experience. And I would say it's not the thinking man's blockbuster, which I've used towards things like Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. The overall enjoyment of the film is a lot more surface level, but with there being so many things that the show has to address, I think overall it did work. So I'm going to say I'm fairly favorable on it. While it not being the best that the Marvel Cinematic Universe has to offer, it certainly was one of the most enjoyable post-Endgame. So with that, that'll wrap up my non-spoiler reviews. I'm going to jump into spoilers. So if you have not seen the film yet and don't want to be spoiled, you can jump past the spoilers and find out what's coming out next week in the outro. All right, so I tweeted about this. At least it was on my Twitter, or it might have been on the Film Realist Twitter. I don't know. I run both, so it could have been either. My biggest issue, and I think what is hurting the success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe post Endgame, is the amount of content, television and cinematic, where we are getting an abundance of characters and we are not revisiting them quickly enough. We had Captain Marvel in 2 appearances in phase 3 of the cinematic universe. We had Monica Rambeau as a child, and then we got her as an adult in WandaVision. But WandaVision came out in 2020, if I remember that correctly. I'm trying to check really quickly on the fly. But these versions of the characters that we are experiencing, when did she show up? She showed up in WandaVision. WandaVision was 2 years ago, 2+ years ago. But we had Miss Marvel. We have all these different characters, and Miss Marvel being an absolute delight and getting to move her forward. But the inconsistency in which we do get to see these characters is becoming more and more frustrating. I don't feel anchored to their versions. One of the elements that this film doesn't address whatsoever, which I found really frustrating, is Secret Invasion. We were introduced to the Kree and the Skrull War in Captain Marvel, and there was a significant retcon saying that they've been around the whole time, and how Ben Mendelsohn's character was involved with Nick Fury and involved in S.H.I.E.L.D. and led to the success of it. And then you have this massive story where Skrulls are inhabiting MCU characters that we know. Rhodey, Martin Freeman's character, Everett Ross, I'm pretty sure that's his name. And that being a big deal and leading to some cataclysmic event where the Skrull are here and the president isn't happy about it, and we get to the next time, the next cinematic appearance of them with the Marvels, and even having a sequence with the Skrulls being on another planet that is destroyed by Ronin 2.0, and Nick Fury and Caro don't talk about it at all. Now, I don't know if that has to do with the release schedule of these properties, but even though I said in the non-spoiler section of the review, I found it really frustrating that you have this show and you have a movie that could easily continue that storyline, or at least address it in any way, and it does not come. It doesn't come up at all. Obviously, we know that this continues Monica Rambeau's story as Photon, and it's funny to me that it never actually comes up what her name is as a superhero. But Miss Marvel, that's specifically being connected to with the Bangles and having to do with using them as some sort of power sponge, and using those abilities to affect the space jumping portals. I don't remember the Nexus. What specifically is those called? I'm not sure exactly, but that resulting in the quantum entanglement amongst all 3 heroes, I found really interesting. I thought maybe we were going to get an explanation as to more into the Bangles, where we know that the Bangles are from another universe, but also Carol has her powers from the Tesseract, and that Monica got her powers from forcing herself through a hex in WandaVision. So how that works, I don't really know. But I do know that it was a result of them touching the different time portal jumps. Again, an element that I found really weird that it's not touched upon in this movie, but then is addressed in, again, we're in full spoilers, is that Kamala's a mutant, and it was a big moment. It's the first time we heard the word mutant in the television or in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but it never comes up at all, particularly with the post-credit scene when Monica has been pushed into another universe, and we see a CGI version of Beast and a different version of, what's her mom's name? I can't remember what her mom's name is. Oh, Maria Rambeau. And Again, we're getting different X-Men teases, and of course it's cool to see Hank McCoy voiced again by, oh my goodness, my brain, Kelsey Grammer. And I really enjoyed that. And I talked about the relationship between the three of them being the crux of the film. This really does work as a sequel to Captain Marvel and Miss Marvel. Outside of that, obviously we got Monica Rambeau in WandaVision, but the scope of her story really has to do with her being left by Carol at the end of the Marvels, or Captain Marvel, and not seeing her for 30 years at this point. And the exploration of those relationships is really the meat of the story in this film. And that part, I think, is executed really well. I think Nia DaCosta had a lot of fun with these three characters together. It is led by three women, which is awesome. It took, how long? 13 years or 12 years to get a female-led film with Black Widow. And then, we got Captain Marvel. So, 11 years. And so getting to continue those storylines all together, I really enjoyed, particularly as somebody who really enjoyed Miss Marvel. And one of the elements I was super happy that they maintained was keeping Kamala's family involved. We didn't get to see the sister-in-law, but we had the brother and the two parents, and continuing that relationship between Kamala and her mom is something that really warmed my heart, particularly with the relationship that they had being significantly more antagonistic and them seeing each other's own perspectives and developing such a stronger bond because of the first or the only season, I guess, and continuing that into this and her not wanting to lose her daughter and seeing that the hero that her daughter has become was awesome. And so those elements I think are handled really well. The abandonment that Monica feels with Carol is done really well. I mentioned in the non-spoiler section of the review where I thought Dar-Ben is mad because Carol destroyed the Great Intelligence, was as a result royally messed up their planet, resulting in their seas drying up and their sun dying. And obviously that is a super negative and not the thing that Carol was looking for. But we really only get 2 scenes to establish that. We don't get any self-reflection from Dar-Ben realizing I'm doing this to save my planet, but I don't care what happens to all the other places. I'm just trying to destroy the places that Carol likes. And if you just did it from a perspective of somebody trying to do the right thing, but ultimately it being a horrible, there's no self-reflection. I know I said that, in where she blames Carol for this, but she is ultimately doing the same thing to other places. We see a different skull habitation on another planet. And again, would have been a great opportunity to talk about what's going on in Earth, but that never comes up. And so she seems very one note. And the fact that the character is not aware of the hypocrisy of her actions, I think is a really misstep. This has continued to be a criticism of Phase 4 and Phase 5. The green screen work in this, and again, I don't blame the visual effects artists. It comes down to the production schedule that these films are made on in particular. You can look this up, where the green screen is bad. A lot of this does feel like it was shot in the volume. Now, there is a significant amount of scope to that, and I think the choreography of any time the three characters are working together with Captain Marvel, Miss Marvel, and Photon, it's a lot of fun, and them getting to use all their powers together. I think those fight sequences in particular are really captivating, and getting to see particularly where Kamala has come with her powers and how she is able to use her hard light powers with the other two is really cool. And how the way that they use their body switching abilities, not in terms of mind, but how they are essentially teleporting into each other's locations. I thought that was really, really cool and added a certain fun snappiness to the action sequence we hadn't seen before. And honestly, it reminded me of what we got to see in the previous Ant-Man movies with the shrinking that we did not really get in Quantumania. So ultimately, I think this movie is a lot of fun. I don't think the plot is as deep as some may have liked, but in terms of just a heartwarming, entertaining film, I think this absolutely succeeds because that is the focus, in doing it successfully. I loved seeing the Khans interact with Nick Fury. Again, this Nick Fury does not feel like he just experienced Secret Invasion, but a lot of the characters' portrayal has been inconsistent, particularly post-Endgame. And the fact that we finally got a tease of the Young Avengers with Kamala and Kate Bishop, probably leading in to do with Cassidy, and I'm trying to think of anybody else younger, and potentially even maybe Morgan Stark would be something I'm looking forward to. I find it interesting that this film does address multiversal travel with what happens with Monica at the end, where I mentioned she travels to an out universe with the X-Men. I thought maybe Loki would have to do with this, but again, we're just getting pieces of the multiverse saga, and I'm really hoping that these things start to have a focus as we are eventually leading into 2 Avengers films that have to do with a multiversal war. But I got nothing else really to say. I quite enjoyed the movie. I think that a team of Photon, Captain Marvel, and Miss Marvel needs to happen again. If not, having all 3 of them as vital parts of the Avengers would be something I'm really looking forward to. I like that this film does end with Carol being on Earth, and hopefully we finally get to really understand what's going on with the Avengers post-Endgame. We've barely heard about them or even addressed what's going on with them. So my hope is we get to see more of Carol Danvers. I liked Brie Larson finally actually getting to play this character, and the relationships, particularly she has with Kamala, being something I'm really hoping we get to see more of them with back and forth. And obviously, if some multiversal elements are required, maybe we will see Monica dealing with a superhero version of her mom, which we saw in the post-credit scene. But again, who knows? Maybe we won't see or hear from these characters for another 3 to 4 years. I got no idea. I don't know if the MCU and Kevin Feige has any idea. So I guess it's just a wait and see. That will do it for my spoiler review of The Marvels. Let's jump into the outro so you can find out what's coming out next week. All right, so I looked at the schedule. I have no idea what I'm going to see, so it might be Trolls, it might be the Hunger Games prequel. The early reviews for that have been good, but maybe I'll take Melody to see Trolls. I haven't really decided. What I did want to do before I ended the episode is, if you are listening to the podcast on Spotify, I do put questions embedded in the episodes. It's been a more recent thing, so I hope you've heard about it. And I wanted to say thanks to a listener who answered 2 of them, and that's Scotty Cameron. The question embedded in the Mask of the Phantasm episode was, who is your favorite Batman? And Scotty Cameron said quite a long answer, so I appreciate that. Animation, Kevin Conroy. Live action, Christian Bale from the Nolan universe. In gaming, Kevin Conroy in the Arkham universe. And then the comics, a post-Crisis Elseworlds White Knight universe. So several different versions. Thanks so much, Scotty Cameron, for the answer. These are all there. There's no expiration, I don't think, to any of them. So if you want to answer them and have your answers read on the podcast, you can. The other one, which was embedded in the Batman episode, I had reviewed. I apologize. But let's see, so Scotty Cameron answered as well. A few of my favorites. So the original Halloween, the 2018 Halloween, the original Scream, and then Scream 2022, which I believe is Scream 6, as well as Saw, Socks, or Saw X, Alien, Aliens, and any Batman movie. So I'm assuming, Scotty Cameron, that you watch all of these over Halloween. If so, what is your order in watching those? So all of these questions are listed with the episodes. The most recent was, will Invincible fight another version of himself in Invincible Season 2? There will be a question embedded in this episode, so you'll have to wait and see to see what that is. Again, I don't know what I'm going to be reviewing next week. It's either going to be Trolls or the Hunger Games spinoff. I honestly can't even remember what it's called. I think it's the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I think that's what it's called. Yes, I've seen all the Hunger Games. I'm not really looking forward to it, although it's been said it's quite good. So I guess we will see. It'll be a surprise. Thank you for listening to the Film Realist podcast. I am Kyle Naranya, your host. Please like and share the podcast on your podcast platforms. If there is a rating system, please give it 5 stars, or you don't even have to, but give a review. Let me know something you'd like me to review on the show if there is a gap in the schedule. That'll do it for this week. I hope to see you on the next episode of the show.